Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Ministry of Finance. My pleasure to welcome you here. We are today discussing a topic that has slowly but surely made its way into our ministry's work, and that topic is climate action. We've all seen what happened during the summer. We've witnessed the highest ever measured average monthly temperatures in July. We saw wood fires and floodings, most tragically in Libya, but also some hitting closer home in Austria. And these events regularly show that climate change is a global challenge which requires global action. Against this background, I'm very grateful for the opportunity to discuss with you later in the panel session, in particular the role that ministries of finance can play in driving climate action. Our ministries certainly hold many keys to create the enabling environment to deliver on the goals of the Paris Agreement and to drive sustainable, inclusive and resilient development and growth. But as we have said on many occasions, national efforts alone will not be enough. And as such, I'm proud that Austria is a founding member of the Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action. And it's my particular pleasure to welcome a visiting delegation of the coalition here today and to explain their work to you. The coalition is a very valuable platform at the international level to strengthen the global response to climate change by making finance flows consistent with a pathway towards climate resilience and climate neutrality. The coalition helps to promote a common understanding of the macroeconomic and financial risks of climate change and offers an opportunity to exchange best practices amongst the broad range of countries on how to meet our ambitious emission reduction targets. So I'm very much looking forward to a fruitful exchange today on the roles of ministries of finance in driving climate action and to learn what we could do more or better and how challenges could be overcome. So without further ado, let me hand over to Elisabeth Widstum, the Sherpa of the coalition, who will introduce our panel and will guide you through the program. Elisabeth, the floor is yours. I can actually stay here.
Yeah, you can if you want. Also a warm welcome from my side, and thank you, Harald, for your welcoming words. Before starting and going into the presentation and the panel discussion, I would like to set a little bit the scene. First of all, we have a panel the presentation by our distinguished guests from the Coalition Secretariat and the Secretariat. And afterwards, we will continue with the panel discussion. And I invite you to keep all your important questions, and I'm sure that many questions will arise, until the end of the panel discussion, and just to make as much, at the time we use, as much possible the time we have, and it's a limited time, and so please make notes or keep in mind what you want to ask. May I now invite my distinguished guests, our panelists for the panel discussion. I would like to start with Pekka Moren. Pekka Moren is a special representative of the Finnish Ministry of Finance since 2020, Finnish member, board member of the Nordic Investment Bank since 2016. Before that, he acted as director on international financial affairs, and you know each other from then. He holds a master in economics and was leading and the most leading person in creating the Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action, and he acted as co-chair from 2019 until spring 2023. Pekka, welcome. And it's without saying that without strong support by the Grantham Research Institute at the London School of Economics, the guide could or would not have been that comprehensive as it is. Therefore, I'm very pleased to welcome Annika Heck-Wolf and Nick Godfrey to present together with Pekka the guide. Annika, is a policy analyst at the Grantham Research Institute, as I said, and coordinated the work with the coalition. And she, I think, worked 2 years or even longer than 2 years on that. Before that, she was Senior Officer of Environmental Disclosure Charity and Oxfam EU Advocacy Office, and she holds also a Master in International Political Economy. Welcome, Annika. Nick Goffrey is Senior Advisor for the Grantham Institute and Senior Advisor and most supporting the coalition. He is a co-founder and director of the Coalition for Urban Transitions until 2021. Before that, member of the executive team of the New Climate Economy, and he holds a Master in Development Economics. And it's quite short, but I squeezed it a little bit. Nick, welcome. So, for the next 30 minutes, and I would like to please stay in time, it's yours.
Thank you very much for setting the scene, and Harald and Elizabeth and Catherine for hosting us and organizing this. This is our guide, the Finance Ministry's guide. I hope you, if you don't feel that yet, maybe in the future you will. That's the intention of this event. Last autumn, the finance ministers, we presented this guide to the finance ministers, and in that context we agreed that one part of the immediate next steps that we present the guide. We've been doing it virtually in a number of international events, and now this is the first, like we call a roadshow event like this. So it's an important experience for us, and we would like to have your feedback and all the comments and have a good dialogue today, and continue that tomorrow with some of the departments. But maybe before we start, a few things about the coalition. Why was the Coalition of Finance Ministers in the first place invented and established? Clearly, there was a problem that when we have set the climate objectives, there is really lack of economic, like macroeconomic, fiscal and financial impact assessments in the context of setting those targets. That's really quite well visible in the strategies, including in my own country. We are now over 90 countries. It kind of also reflects the reality that there is a lot to learn, and these countries have really understood that the importance of this topic. So it's a learning exercise, and our strategy is based on the Helsinki principles. They're the six core principles. And this guide has been really built on those principles. The guide also is in a way a reflection of what we have achieved today, because it brings together really a lot of the information that we produced, about 18 reports, and it gets together a lot of expertise. And we hope that the guide is a practical way of getting into this. This is not a doctor's order or like a holy book. It's supposed to be a menu. It's supposed to present options, and really open door to debate and discussion about it. It is a unique document in the sense that there are many guides, but none of the guides so far is about the role of finance ministries. And it's been really professionally managed, I would say. The Grantham was invited to dedicate the two important experts here, supported by the Secretariat, and have really gathered a big group of experts. About 100 people were involved in the preparation of this from different professional backgrounds of climate economics and finance. And of course, there are 140 country examples, and these were specific requests from the ministers to have these have these country examples. They are in the long version of the guide, which is 250 pages. We will maybe talk about later on how to use this guide, and you will have a chance to offer questions. There are a few paper copies of the synthesis reports, which kind of summarizes the substance. But it's pretty much like why finance ministries are needed, finance ministers are needed, what is sort of practical framework. Annika and Nick will present that, and of course, what will happen next. We will finish the presentation with that. But right now, I think it's time to let Annika and Nick to go a bit deeper into the framework. Thank you very much. Annika.
Thank you, Pekka. Good afternoon, everyone. Nick here, as Elizabeth generously introduced me. So look, my task is to say a bit more about why, in our view, finance ministries matter so much for climate action. But before I do, just want to throw some stats at you and some points of interest. So, you know, can any of you tell me which country this applies to? Net zero by 2040, a decade ahead of the EU. No new coal. 100% net renewable energy by 2030. Ambitious carbon pricing scheme going over and above the EU ETS with a regional climate bonus for the most impacted communities. 2030 mobility master plan, green spending review, eco-social tax reform, financial sector reform. Can anyone guess which country that is? It's the one that we're in now, of course, and all of you have been part of that transformation. So I want to start off just by saying congratulations. It seems to me the task that you have in mind is, number one, to accelerate implementation, and number two, to be even more ambitious. And what I want to do is say why your work in the finance ministry and beyond is so important to that. So urgency of action. So look, many of you will know this. The window for avoiding dangerous climate change is narrowing very, very rapidly. There's a very large gap between national climate strategies and temperature targets, and between the strategies on the table globally and the policies and financial resources to deliver them. So right now, we're on track to see a 10% increase in carbon emissions by the end of this decade on 2010 levels. We need to see a close to 50% reduction to stay on target for the goals laid out in the Paris Climate Agreement. So a very, very large gap between ambition and what's actually happening on the ground. So we need to see a dramatic, to deliver that scale of emission cuts on a global basis, of course, we need to see a dramatic economic transformation to reach zero emissions by mid-century and to adapt to the fast-changing climate. We've got to see no less than the fundamental reorganization of the global economy. We need to see investment in 4 key areas. Clearly transforming the major emitting sectors through the total decarbonization of energy, buildings, transport, industry and agriculture, enormously important. 2, strengthening adaptive capacity and building resilience is critical. 3, protecting and restoring natural capital, including through sustainable land use practices, cuts across all of this, as well as 4th, fostering a just transition to make sure no one gets left behind and that we can take forward effective climate policy. And of course, this dramatic economic transformation requires investment. It requires investment to be increased and sustained above pre-COVID levels by at least 2% of GDP year on year for the next decade and beyond, and closer to 4 to 5% in emerging markets and developing countries. Thankfully, you as Austria have recognized that you need to be investing at least between 2 and 3% of GDP in the transition, so congratulations on that. But you can see there's a very large gap between the climate finance on the table, on the left-hand side here globally, less than $1 trillion per annum, and what's actually required based on a whole number of different estimates. And to unlock that investment, finance ministries will be absolutely at the heart of that economic transformation and unlocking that investment. You as finance ministries, as centre of government bodies, you sit right at the crux of coordinating economic, fiscal and financial policy, mobilising investment. You have an overview of the whole economy. You oversee the global family finance ministries, oversee close to $30 trillion in public expenditure on an annualised basis. And of course, play an enormous role in shaping the $100 trillion global economy. And that is no different in Austria. You often regulators and shareholders in state-owned enterprises, development banks, sovereign wealth funds, and have a critical role working with the central bank in supervising the financial sector, and clearly you form part of the global family and network of finance ministries. In our view, climate action can help you as a finance ministry achieve your core priorities of macro stability, growth and responsible management of the public finances. We lay out in the Guide to Action that climate action can help you, one, avoid escalating risks with macro-critical consequences. Second, help unlock significant growth and development benefits while generating significant cost savings. There's a little error on this slide. But third, we believe that climate action can indeed help to unlock a triple resilience dividend, A, in terms of avoided economic costs, and B, in terms of broader societal and environment benefits. And of course, right at the moment, delivering cheap, secure, and clean energy and fighting inflation is more important than ever before. So in our view, climate action really can be the development and growth story of the 21st century. And just to unpack the economic opportunity a little bit, so in our view, ministries of finance should be particularly mindful that failure to act on climate will have growing impacts on revenues and the costs of capital. We're already seeing the economic and budgetary consequences of growing climate impacts on critical infrastructure all around the world. We're already seeing increasing cost of capital through climate impacts on sovereign risk ratings for those nations that are least prepared. And climate impacts for Austria are going to be already relatively significant and are likely to increase over time. Clearly, unprepared finance ministries will see an erosion of the tax base with the inevitable global shift towards electrification and new technologies, exposure of key sectors to volatility in global oil and gas markets. So all of these factors need to be considered. So really, building on that, slow action can indeed undermine the scale of the opportunities and benefits from the type of transition we need to see. In our view, early movers will generate competitiveness advantages from spurring innovation and investment in new green sectors, new net job opportunities, yes, with some disruption in the short term, but in the longer term can generate new jobs in green sectors, wide-ranging co-benefits. And indeed, what many commentators perhaps don't give enough attention to is we're already seeing cost parity for renewable energy vis-a-vis fossil fuels in most of the world's major markets now. But actually we're seeing cost competitiveness in many other sectors starting to emerge. This graph here just gives you a sense of, in energy, we're already seeing mass market potential for renewable energy, but actually in some other sectors, even green steel, we're going to, in the not too distant future, see market maturity. And there's potential for technology to reach tipping points in sectors that are responsible for over 80% of global emissions right now. And in our view, finance ministries that create the conditions for these tipping points can have and unlock the benefits of lower cost energy, reduced exposures to fossil fuel energy pricing, net job creation, and broader ancillary benefits. And the good news is, finance ministries world over, and you'll see this laid out in the guide, over 140 examples of finance ministries taking real leadership on this agenda. And Annika will say something more about that in a moment. But you, as the Austrian Ministry of Finance and stakeholders more broadly, are right at the heart of this story and are right at the kernel of ambition as well. But of course, much more needs to happen. Systemic reform has yet to happen in many finance ministries. Substantial disconnect between the ambition of national climate strategies and supporting policies and resources provided. Only around a quarter of the coalition of finance ministers are actively involved in all stages of national climate strategy development. Less than $1 trillion in capital going into this agenda. Less than 10 finance ministries globally have dedicated climate strategies. Meanwhile, we continue to pour money into fossil fuel subsidies, and carbon pricing has not been effective, either in terms of scale of price and coverage. So finance ministries everywhere have to push much further to overcome the barriers to action and to systematically integrate climate into core functions and capabilities. Finally, just to say, there are many barriers to action, but indeed, in our view, many of these barriers can be overcome with the right political and technical leadership and effort. And I'm not going to go into this in too much more detail here. Annika will cover some of this in a bit more. The final word I did want to say was that finance ministries, of course, cannot act alone, nor should they. Strategic partnership with other government agencies is absolutely critical. And in the Guide to Action, we lay out where should finance ministries place their focus in terms of core responsibilities linked to core functions, but also where can finance ministries support and empower and equip other actors across government and form meaningful strategic partnerships. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Anna, who's going to talk us through a bit more, going to unpeel the onion a bit more and walk through the Guide to Action. Anna, over to you.
Thanks, Nick. Thanks, Pekka, and thanks, Katharina and Elisabeth. As Nick said, I really want to spend the next couple of minutes diving into what is the heart of the guide, what we call the Ministry of Finance framework for climate action. And just to say, when we set out to write this guide, we realized there isn't really anything out there that kind of comprehensively lays out what the role of a finance ministry should be in the 21st century, how a finance ministry can comprehensively mainstream climate action into all of its areas of work. So this guide, and in particular this framework, is really our attempt to close this gap. So I'm going to just spend a minute or so explaining the framework to you. I was kind of hoping to have a screen behind me where I can point at. That's not going to work, but I'm sure we'll manage to go through it anyways. So the framework consists of 3 functions that you can see in dark blue at the top, which are based on the typical responsibilities that the Ministry of Finance has. Of course, each finance ministry is slightly different. Then we have 3 capabilities, which are kind of needed for finance ministries to actually perform these functions, and then we have a cross-cutting function, a cross-cutting area as well. So looking at the 3 functions, we start off with what we call economic strategy and vision, and this is really about how finance ministry can use the center of government position that Nick described earlier to get involved in upstream planning processes, in particularly, of course, climate plans, NDCs, long-term strategies, national adaptation plans, and then really use this involvement also to drive other development, like for instance, national development plans, investment strategies, of course, working together with the relevant ministries, like the Ministry of Environment that might be in charge. Then we have function 2, which is around fiscal policy. So that discusses how finance ministries can use both the tax and the budget and all these levers they have in these areas to basically implement these strategies. And the third function is the finance function, so it talks about both financial policy, finance, and basically what finance ministries can do to bring together different sources of finance, public, private, domestic, international, to raise this capital and to close this gap that Nick showed us earlier on the slide. Then on the capabilities, in the middle row, we start with leadership capability, which is really around how finance ministries can reform kind of the institutional setup, their governance processes in line with climate action, for instance, through developing a climate strategy, perhaps by setting up a climate unit, by strengthening their mandate on climate. Then the second capability is around collaboration and coordination, so how finance ministries can work both with other partners in government and beyond to really drive climate action in a whole of government and whole of economy approach. And then we have the human and analytical capability, which discusses the different measures finance ministries can take around staffing, training, building skills and expertise, but also things like enhancing economic decision-making models, having the right data to really be in a position to drive all of these other processes. And then last but not least, we have a cross-cutting area, the just transition, because as we argue in the report, there's basically going to be no transition without a just transition. So just transition policies really need to be mainstreamed into all climate policy. So these are the different action areas, as we call them. Pekka would call it the menu of options that we discuss in the guide. It's quite expansive. I'm not going to go through all of it, but just kind of give you a couple ideas of the different areas we cover. And I think, well, those in the finance ministry will see that there are some areas where you'll be like, oh yeah, already doing that, great. And maybe there'll be some other areas where you'll be inspired to look into a bit more in the future. For instance, we cover areas like in the fiscal policy bucket, of course, we talk about carbon pricing, and of course, you have your big eco-social tax reform that happened. We, of course, talk about the power of the budget, green budgeting, etc. In the financing bucket or function, I should say, we talk about the importance of mobilizing domestic revenues to finance investment. And of course, Austria is one of many countries that has a green bond. But there might be some other areas that are perhaps a bit less obvious that are also central for ministries of finance, like potentially getting involved in industrial strategy to really accelerate investment or accelerate transformation in key sectors. There might be questions around how a Ministry of Finance can work with public institutions, public financial institutions, where finance ministries are often shareholders, and kind of drive their transformation. Excuse me. And of course, on the capability side, there are many questions to consider, like, does the finance ministry need a specific mandate on climate? Does it need a climate unit? Does it need a climate strategy? How can it develop the skills that are needed? So yeah, to bring kind of the guide to life a bit more, what I'm going to do the next couple of minutes is just kind of dip in and out of some of these areas. Not going to go through all of them in detail, but hopefully it'll still provide you with a bit of an overview of what we cover and what might be of interest. I will be rushing through some of those slides. I will also be skipping some of those slides. Don't worry if there's any information you'd like to retain. I'm sure we can find a way to send the slides to everyone at the end. There we go. So I want to skip the first function today and start with fiscal policy, and more specifically start with the budget, because one central argument that we make in the guide is, of course, that the budget is one of the most important levers that a finance ministry has, or one of the most important entry points, as we call it, to drive climate actions. And because finance ministries don't only need to understand the impact that climate has on the public spending, but also, of course, need to use the budget process in a way that helps really, or that accelerates spending on both adaptation and mitigation. But I actually don't want to dive into any more detail here, because the budget is, of course, not the only lever that finance ministry has, and another really important one is fiscal policy. And this is actually another key message in the guide, that there is no silver bullet when it comes to climate policy. So the budget is one thing, carbon pricing might be one thing, but there are currently, or countries are experiencing a quite range of market failures and market barriers and non-market barriers, and there is no single tool or policy that can help us overcome them. So what is really needed is a good mix of different strategies. So carbon pricing is, of course, a really central one, be it carbon taxation or emissions trading, and of course, subsidy reform also comes into that. But in addition to that, there's also really a need to implement additional policies, ideally in a kind of comprehensive way, so that they form what we call smart policy packages. So that, for instance, means developing policy packages that also include tax incentive, loan programs, guarantees, cash grants, etc., and also using regulation, of course, where appropriate. But when it comes to aligning fiscal policy with climate change, there's also broader questions to consider. And of course, the question is, or the broadest question of them all, is whether the tax system as a whole is ready for net zero, and whether it will kind of remain resilient throughout the changes that can be expected as climate change accelerates. And therefore, one thing we recommend that countries do is that they conduct a review of the entire tax system to ensure that that's the case. So that means, on the one hand, checking that existing taxes support the transition, but also, of course, checking whether revenue is protected in the future. And for many countries, that will mean thinking about revenue diversification, so thinking about to what extent fossil fuel revenues are going to be able to be replaced with other revenues, for instance, from new forms of taxation, like road pricing, taxes on electricity, or even wealth or digital services. Okay, next I want to talk a little bit about financing. Of course, we know that in order to reach net zero emissions, and Nick has laid that out, the world really needs to massively ramp up spending on investment, and ministries of finance really have a dual role here. On the one hand, they need to ensure that they draw on all sources of capital so that that's available for green investment, public, private, domestic, international, concessional, non-concessional, all these different buckets. But secondly, they also have a role, of course, in making sure that the conditions are created so that the financial system as a whole can be transformed and be aligned with the goals of the Paris Agreement as outlined in Article 2.1c. Just to talk a little bit about drawing on sources of finance, I've mentioned green bonds before. That's, of course, an area that many countries currently use to kind of create as a new source of revenue generation. So I won't go in any detail here. I will also skip this slide. In terms of greening the overall financial system, finance ministries, of course, also have a number of levers to pull, and one that I mentioned earlier is perhaps less often talked about is the role they have as shareholders in public financial institutions. For instance, national development banks, state-owned enterprises, sovereign wealth funds, etc. And finance ministries can really here play a key role in helping to green these institutions and drive their spending towards the transition, including by reviewing their mandates, of course engaging with the board in their role as shareholders, possibly reforming incentives, etc. One public institution that finance ministries should also closely collaborate with are central banks, because they have a key role in overseeing the economy, the financial system. They also have reserve portfolios that might potentially need to be aligned with climate change. And there's a number of things that finance ministries can do here, of course, keeping in mind central bank independence and not interfering with that. And actually one of the key things that would help here is for finance ministries to clarify or to resolve tensions around remits that central banks have, because many are currently in a position where they don't really know whether or to what extent they can be active on climate. But finance ministries, at least, those that are responsible for kind of defining the remit of a central bank can really provide some clarity here. The last bit on finance. One tool that we recommend that finance ministries consider are these sustainable finance roadmaps that can really bring together all the different actors in the financial system. And a number of finance ministries have recently published such roadmaps. And I think the key for them to be a successful, difficult word today, is for them to be really broad, cover all the kinds of different topics, cover all parts of the financial system, so not just the private sector, but much beyond that. And this, for instance, might be a way for the Austrian Finance Ministry actually to bring together all the different initiatives that already exist and kind of bring them under one umbrella, but also find gaps, perhaps. Then I want to finish off, of course, with a little bit of info about the capabilities, because this is, of course, the other area we address in the guide. We have 3 capabilities that we talk about, just as a reminder: leadership, coordination, and skills and expertise. And when it comes to the first one, leadership, we found that there are 3 factors that are particularly helpful for a finance ministry that's trying to strengthen its work on climate. The first one is a clear mandate on climate. I'll come to that in a second. The second one is a climate strategy, or perhaps integrating climate into an overarching organizational strategy where it exists. And the third one is a strong institutional setup. And that usually means having some kind of climate unit or climate hub, representing all the climate work happening in the ministry and coordinating the work happening in the different departments. In terms of mandates on climate, one could, of course, argue that a finance ministry already has an implicit mandate to act on climate, because as climate change affects public finances, that means finance ministries have a role. But what we found is that for many finance ministries, it has been really beneficial to have an explicit and formal mandate that acknowledges they have a responsibility on climate, because it basically means, it basically helps them to mobilize capacity internally, it helps to drive reforms internally, but it also really enhances collaboration with other government departments and agencies, because they have a clear understanding of what the role of the finance ministry is and how they can work with them. Just having a look at the time, I'm just going to skip these slides, but I can come back later as part of the panel. I just want to finish with a couple case studies just to give you an idea of the different countries and examples we cover in the guide. So I'm a big fan of the Uruguay case study. So Uruguay has achieved almost 100% renewable electricity generation over the last couple of years. And the Finance Ministry, or rather the Ministry of Economy and Finance in Uruguay, has really played quite a substantial role in this process, particularly by providing the tax incentives necessary to generate the expansion in solar and wind that was needed to reach that goal. Another great example is Ireland, where perhaps a bit similar to here in Austria, they've combined carbon pricing with a very strong just transition component, and they've designed their carbon tax in a way that protects the most vulnerable from the impacts of the tax. And I think up to 1/3 of the revenue they generate through the tax kind of goes straight back into social protection support measures like child credit, support for single families, etc. And just one last example I want to mention is in the US, where after the Biden administration took over, Secretary Janet Yellen kind of immediately established a high-level climate counselor in the Treasury, and with that together also a climate hub. And that climate hub basically exists to coordinate all the climate work happening in the different units and also to represent the Treasury externally. And this has really kind of helped to, well, increase the efficiency of the work on climate within the Treasury. And I will skip these other slides, but happy to come back to some of those later if needed. And hand back to Nick.
Yeah, I think we're... Thanks, Annika. We're going to conclude now just by saying, well, all these great words, fantastic. Please read the guide. But how do we go from guide to action?
Don't read all of it, it's too long.
Okay. How do we go from guide to action? The guide really lays this out in some detail. How can different finance ministries, given their national circumstance, really move this agenda forward? Just one thing I wanted to recognize is that, many finance ministries we speak to say, well, there's many trade-offs here. And in our view, yes, there will be trade-offs, but many trade-offs that we encounter are perceived, not actual. And actually the solution space for generating win-win solutions is normally quite much more significant than you might often realize. So in our view, we have to recognize there are some real trade-offs. We also have to recognize there are some perceived trade-offs. And in our view, there's a number of principles that can assist you as decision makers in navigating the challenges of actual and perceived trade-offs. So really, I don't have time to go into this, but searching for synergies before focusing on trade-offs is really important. There are many actions which climate investment links to delivering on a number of other priorities. So looking for those synergies is really important. Let's not let uncertainty quench ambition. Please consider the risks of business as usual. Please revise outdated assumptions. The IEA, have constantly underestimated the cost reductions in renewable energy over the last decade. We've seen a 90% reduction in cost of solar PV, and that is happening in other sectors now. And please consider second and third order impacts, of climate investment, cheaper electricity, productivity gains. So there are ways in which trade-offs can be navigated. The guide finishes with a call to action for finance ministries. It lays out 15 transformative actions that you as a finance ministry can take to deliver both in the short term and provide a commitment to longer term reform. We don't have time to go into detail at this stage, but please have a look at that. And I think I'm going to turn over to Pekka, who's really going to lay out the foundation for the discussion by saying how tangibly is the coalition of finance ministers supporting its members to go from guide to action. But for me, congratulations on everything you're doing as a ministry. It's impressive. Over to you, Pekka.
Thank you, Nick and Annika. If there was one picture from the guide to show, it would be this one. So that's why I also want to say a few words about it. In Finland right now, as we are sharing country example, we have put together a climate and nature strategy. If you look at it, it's on the website. It looks quite fancy. It's quite well articulated. But now only we are thinking about how to actually make it happen. And we need to do it in the context of the reality that there's a lot of fiscal consolidation, so resources will not be there automatically. So we are not going to increase the headcount very easily. So that's why this is important. It really is like how do you build capacity You need to be smart, use the networks around you at the national level, at the international level, and of course, really think which policy areas are the key ones. So I think this is an important point to make in terms of implementation. And then, at this point, there is one extra introduction. Frank van Lerven has jumped to this high-speed train a few months back and is now with the co-chairs of the Dutch and Indonesians thinking about how to actually do the next step. So Frank is there. He also, you may send him emails about any feedback and useful contact for the future. But four things. One is also relevant to mention to you in the context of raising awareness, helping out each other. We are thinking of putting together ambassador network. We call it ambassador network, even if we come from the finance ministry, but it's a group of country Sherpas or colleagues who may join these kind of sessions, mission teams in the future, and help out the spread the word and get a bit deeper into the work. So that's a new initiative that we hope to put in place in the coming months. And then capacity building, a few words more about it in a sec, and utilizing research networks. We have a lot of those around us, and that's really important in different levels: local level, regional level, international level. We have 26 institutional partners. Many of them could also serve that function already. Then ministers themselves, I mean, this is ministers' coalition. It's not by accident. It's really because change will come only from top down. So that's really important point to make. So ministers will be discussing these matters regularly in their meetings, at least twice a year. And last point is about capacity building. Even if this is in the global context, more relevant to the low and middle income countries. But I would like to make one point on this. As EU countries like Finland and Austria, maybe it will be useful to think how we could utilize EU, because EU has a lot of resources, how to in a smart way also build capacities, competencies in the EU context. We have many working groups, horizontal matters. Maybe there is more room for finance ministers in the future to also scale up efforts with the support of the European Commission. And of course, this is the global picture. We have the C3A, a newly launched World Bank program, and there are many partners who can help scaling up these activities. So this is really the key avenues here in this slide. So it's quite a soup. It's a very big network of expertise and many cooks, but one challenge, and that is to try to see how we can best benefit from that. So I think that's it from our side. Thanks, Nick. Thanks, Harald. Thanks, Annika. I think we're ready for Elizabeth's further instructions. Thanks very much.
Many thanks to this really comprehensive presentation on the guide, and also many thanks that you highlighted, especially Nick, you did, to mention all the efforts already done and are underway in the Ministry of Finance. I have my distinguished colleagues with us, and I think they're very pleased to hear that, and that we are on the right way forward. But there's still more to do, and you mentioned this in a quite impressive way, that there is a mixed bag here now, and I think we should try now to nail it a little bit down to more practice. And for that, I would like to invite two more panelists. First of all, I would like to invite Fabio Rumler, from the Österreichische Nationalbank. Please join us. And Nick van Lerven, who came in, Frank, not Nick, sorry, Frank, sorry. He came in with quite some struggles, no suitcase. The first thing he had to do this morning is to get some tie and shirt. So many thanks that you are here. Fabio Rumler, he is head of International Economics Section at the Österreichische Nationalbank and a lecturer at the Vienna University of Economics. And since 2011, he is professor for economics. Frank van Lerven, he works with the World Bank Coalition Secretariat, and he will also represent the Dutch and the Indonesian co-chairs, who are unfortunately not here because they're at the New York Climate Week, and they have also to do something working out on the Coalition Secretariat in DC. So Frank, it's great that you are here. Besides his coalition function, and he's very, very strongly involved and has been involved in building up the coalition or putting together the coalition. He is also working with the World Bank. We have a World Bank colleague here, and on the capacity on climate action. And before that, he was senior economist and program lead for a UK think tank, and has also experience with UNDP. And he holds also a master in economics. Great that you are with us. And finally, I forgot to introduce Harald. Most of you know him, but to make the picture complete, Harald is with the Ministry of Finance since 2007. He served 2 ministers as tax and economic officer and became Director General for economic policy and financial markets in 2012. We lost customs, but that's thing how they happen. And beside that, Harald has quite a lot of international functions. He's member of the board of directors of the European Financial Stability Facility, chairman of the EU Financial Service Committee, chairman of the and chairman of the Board Risk Committee, and the European Stability Mechanism. So a very busy man and traveling quite a lot. Having you here now, I would like to start the panel discussion with turning to Becca again. Becca, you mentioned already the work you have done and what you can recommend. What would you say is the most important thing around the guide that finance ministers and central bankers and how they can use the guide? We know it's an apolitical menu of recommendations, and it's very important, it's apolitical. So it's really open, and please, just a few words.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and by the way, to facilitate that, getting into the guide, there are 3 versions: the summary, brief one, and then the synthesis report, and then the full 250 pages with all the country examples that is to facilitate the use of the guide. But I would say just a few points at the individual level. Just go and have a look at your specific area where you're working at. Like I've tested it a couple of times when I've been participating in discussions, really going a bit deeper into the substance. They're really good information packages, comprehensive pictures in certain areas. So I think that's the individual side, how you can use it. And then, of course, the management side, maybe more to Harald to have these kind of discussions here in-house. And also, as I said, what does it mean? What would this mean for the leadership of a ministry, and subject to coordination, cooperation with other ministries? And of course, I already mentioned the ministerial discussions. The fact is that there is the political side and the technical side. So the ministers will need to set priorities and no one else can really do that when you start thinking about mandates, for example, and institutional ways of working. And the last thing that I like to mention here is that please do give feedback. This is this is a living document in the sense that there will be updates, and we want the next version to be better. There is already today's discussions that we had over lunch, for example, an area, for example, we got good feedback that maybe the communication strategy could be an issue to underline more in the future. It's not been reflected much now in the report, but that's quite important in order to create an environment where citizens and firms and stakeholders need clear signals about predictability of the policies. So it's quite an important point. But thanks. I think those are a few things from my side.
Thank you, Becca. I can imagine that you have much more to tell following this building up the coalition and also what's at home in the national, on the national side. But thanks for being short. I would now like to turn to Fabio. Fabio, we have heard a little bit about cooperation, collaboration, and we also know that there might be a need when it comes to climate finance, and not only climate finance, but sustainable finance. There is a big role for the central banks. And what and why do you think it is important for central banks to deal with these questions? And then maybe you can also say a few words on the network, the NGCF network on greening the financial system. It's a little bit a coalition or apart from the coalition. Please.
Okay, thank you, Elizabeth, for the kind introduction. So some of you might wonder why a central banker is allowed to speak here among these distinguished experts on climate change. Why are we concerned with climate change? I mean, we're all concerned about climate change, but why are we concerned with climate change? I'm going to explain. It is important to stress here that in climate policy, central banks are not a policy maker, but a policy taker. Or, as our governor likes to put it, we are not in the driving seat. Nevertheless, we are strongly affected by climate change and climate policies in our main mandate. The main mandate of the central bank, as you know, is price stability and derived from that financial stability. And it turns out that climate change poses a challenge to both. How is price stability affected? Quite clearly, and you've witnessed it recently, global warming and more severe and extreme weather events create supply and demand shocks, demand through real income, in the short run that disturb the price level. In the short run, these shocks are usually inflationary and have the potential to really increase inflation a lot. In the medium run, that's not so clear, and actually we're doing a lot of research on that. It could be that there are demand shocks in the medium run or in the long run that are actually inflation dampening. The same for climate policy, for instance, introducing a CO2 price or taxes, emission allowances, causes the price level to increase in the short run. Also, probably regulatory measures do so as well. But in the medium run, technological innovation in energy production and in other technologies could drive down the price of producing energy, and by that could be deflationary. So it is not clear in the long run how climate change and climate action is going to affect the price level. But in any case, we have to closely observe it and take it into account when setting monetary policy. An additional challenge in a monetary union is the fact that not all countries are affected equally by climate change. Some countries are affected more, others less. and the reaction, the policies are also different. So this poses an additional challenge for the cohesion of for the real economy and also for the inflation development within the monetary union that we have to closely monitor. This was about price stability. Now, how is financial stability affected? And I'm going to be a bit brief here because the channels are very complicated. Climate change has the potential to disturb monetary transmission. As other sources of uncertainty, it could increase precautionary savings, the risk premia in the financial markets, the collateral of monetary policy operations becomes more risky. It has most probably a dampening effect on R star, the natural real interest rate, through productivity and also population developments. A smaller R star means that the likelihood of hitting the effective lower bound, zero lower bound of monetary policy is more frequent, and there are more, monetary policy, more severe monetary policy cycles. So all this has to be kept in mind and monitor closely. There is maybe a small area where we do have a leverage on affecting the economy, which is by selecting the bonds in the purchase programs. If you select more green bonds of environmentally concerned companies, then you change the relative price of green versus brown bonds, which could help green companies to reduce their financing cost. But only if, and this is a big if, the green and brown bonds are no close substitutes. If those two are two separate markets. If not, then not environmentally concerned investors will outwash the effects of this selecting of green bonds in the purchasing programs. Despite this low role or small role of central banks in really setting policy in climate change, there is, as you mentioned before, a network, the NGFS, the Network for Greening the Financial System, which can be seen as the counterpart to the coalition that we have heard about today. And this is a group of central banks and supervising institutions that on a voluntary basis exchange their experiences and best practices to contribute to the development of environment and climate risk management in the financial sector, and to mobilize finance to support the transition towards a sustainable economy. The network exists since 2017. It has 127 members. The Austrian Central Bank is one of them. It is organized in 6 work streams. I'm not going to mention them. They have a very good website where you can look it up. There is a lot of work done. They have a number of really very interesting publications, and in particular, they develop climate scenarios, but not weather scenarios, more financial scenarios, depending on different assumptions on the climate change. And one thing I want to stress, and maybe you have seen it recently in the media, is the ECB's economy-wide climate stress test. As the stress test done for the banking sector, if, for instance, interest rates increase, if the banking sector as a whole and single institutions get into stress, a similar exercise is done for the climate stress, and they have 3 scenarios that have been. The scenarios have been defined by the NGFS, and they simulate the economic consequences of that. And the most recent, the second of this stress test, brought the result that the scenario where you accelerate investment in greening the economy, the front loading of the green investment, significantly reduces medium-term financial risk and the risks facing households and firms. If you want to know more about it, you can take a look on the ECB homepage. And I guess I stop here in order not to consume all your time.
That's good. Thank you so much, and I'm quite sure that you will get quite a lot of questions. I think this network on greening the financial system will also have a gathering as the coalition at the COP 2028 on the Finance Day. So maybe there will be some collaboration ongoing and exchange. Now I would like to turn to Harald. We have heard quite a lot from Nick about what they are pleased, what the Ministry of Finance already does. And I would like to invite you to give also an overview, especially on financial market issues and what we do here in the Ministry, and if you think it's enough and it's the right thing.
Right. Well, I'm sometimes surprised myself at how many things we do at the Ministry of Finance and how many things we're responsible for. Sometimes, even after almost 15 years, I discover new things that the ministry actually does. So I'll briefly say something on the areas of sustainable finance where we are responsible and what we do. And I start actually with the areas that I know the least about, because I'm not directly responsible for them, and that's of course the budget. But I see my colleagues from the budget department here. They have their own climate team that specifically focuses on issues like green budgeting and the spending reviews that you heard about, which are very, very important. There's of course also the tax system where you need to set the right incentives for green technologies, the transition, and sometimes also penalize brown technologies. I don't see any colleagues from the tax department here, but that's a vast area that could that would actually warrant its own panel. The thing that we are concerned with in our department is mostly, of course, the financial sector. There's a bit of budget involved through the European element, Next Generation EU. Of course, the around 700 billion that we spend with Next Generation EU in the various member states also have an earmark for greening the economy. Around 40% of the funds there are spent on sustainable activities or measures. And we actually look at the member states' RPPs, the recovery and the resilience, and now I forget what the moniker stands for. Anyway, the plans that you need to do, where you show where the investments go to and what reforms you undertake. And we monitor those, we decide on the payments, and we check on the measures. When it comes to the financial sector, of course, one thing that you need to bear in mind is we've heard about the investment needs for the transition, and the Commission's own estimates range. I think that the size is about 600 billion per year until 2030. But not all of that can come from the public sector. The private sector has to play a very important role, and the financial sector actually provides tools and empowers the private sector to do that. How? First of all, by providing transparency. We have a range of rules where corporates and financial institutions need to disclose what kind of sustainable activities they're financing, why those are sustainable, and this is also audited. By the way, this is nothing that we have invented at the Austrian level. This is harmonized throughout the EU in the so-called disclosure regulation and the sustainable corporate sustainability reporting directive for the corporate sector and the financial sector. So this is about knowing what companies do. Then, of course, there's the area of avoiding greenwashing that has to do with that. When it comes to ratings, for instance, there are rules and regulations for green audits and how rating companies assess the sustainability of activities. Of course, the transparency also plays a part in that, how you disclose and which activities are actually recognized as green. And the third element is enable the financial sector and companies to get funding for green activities, and these are things like the green bond standard that we've heard of before, but also other things, special rules and regulations in the banking sector, for instance, or for capital markets. So this is quite a huge package that we deal with. Not all of it is actually concluded. The Sustainable Finance Action Plan at the European level is a big package. We've managed to conclude some of the dossiers in there, but we're still working on others. And when you ask me whether that's enough or whether we should do more, I think the room for maneuver for a national administration is very limited. And I realize when I go through the activities, at least when it comes to financial sector regulation, I would say 99% of financial sector regulation is harmonized because we have a single market in the European Union. So anything we do has to start at the European Union level. And that makes sense. I mean, Austria is a small country with a relatively small financial sector. So I think we do best when we discuss positions at the European level and try to influence them in a way and push them in a direction that we want them to go.
Thank you so much, Harald. And I'm quite sure that you, as one of the representatives of Austria there, you are pushing quite hard and try to bring them on the right way. And now I would like to turn to Annika. I said before that they were joking women power in the middle. You and Nick, please come in. I think the Ministry of Finance ran out of these white chairs. That's why you are sitting down there. Sorry for that. But you have heard now what the Ministry, and you have already read before that what the Ministry of Finance here in Austria already does. And what else, from a critical and researcher point of view, would be necessary that ministries of finance do, and maybe also central bankers, and really a little bit critical, because sometimes there are the issues quite on the table, budgeting, sustainable financing, green bonds, but what else?
Can I just take this from you? Thank you. I think I'll stick to the finance ministries today. I don't think I feel I'm well positioned to talk about central banks. But yeah, I mean, first of all, just to reiterate, obviously, we've heard so much about what the finance ministry is already doing, and there really is some excellent work going on in line with, I guess, what we consider emerging best practice. So I just wanted to commend that again. But you did ask me to be open and critical, so I will make some suggestions for a couple areas that you might want to consider. Please apologies if you've done so already. Obviously, I'm not familiar with everything that's happening or that's being discussed in the ministry. But if we kind of come back to the framework slide, which I'm not going to bother putting up now, I think one way to look at it is, there's clearly some amazing work going on the tax side, on the budget side, on the financial policy side. But if you remember, the framework also had a second component, and that was the light blue kind of capability area. And kind of my emerging understanding is that there are a couple areas that might be worth looking into in further detail and see whether the ministry can do a number of things to kind of strengthen the relevant capabilities. And just to mention 4 areas briefly, I've mentioned or brought up a couple during the presentation already. One area that many finance ministries struggle with is the question of a mandate. I've mentioned that before. And we've kind of had the experience, or our research has kind of shown that finance ministries that do have an explicit formal mandate, whether it's through legislation, a government program, or an internal strategy, can really kind of help both with setting the internal priorities or internal capacity of the finance ministry, but also helps with external collaboration. So that might be something worth looking into. Strongly or closely related to that is the question of a climate strategy. It's not, sadly, it wasn't one of the case studies that I managed to talk about, but Pekka, you actually mentioned that, so maybe you should talk a bit more about that later. So Pekka mentioned that Finland now has a climate and nature, the Finnish finance ministry now has a climate and nature strategy. And there's a number of finance ministries out there that have over the last years either developed specific kind of internal climate strategies or I should say, integrated climate into their internal organizational strategies. And that's really another opportunity to kind of, well, think about what are the priorities of the ministry, what are the resources needed, what are the actions, what are the KPIs. And obviously, if that strategy is then published externally, is also a really helpful tool to improve collaboration with other actors, because they can then see, okay, this is what the finance ministry is doing, this is perhaps who the contact person is, this is what the plans are. So that can really kind of help driving the work that's happening in the functions. Another point is that of a climate unit. So I've learned that there is already a climate unit in the budget ministry, but what we're seeing as well in other finance ministries, and I of course mentioned the case study of the US earlier, is a kind of organizational-wide climate, like basically overarching climate unit that could really bring together kind of the work happening in all different areas. And as you were mentioned earlier, Harald, you don't even know what's happening in some corners of your ministry, so that could potentially be the advantage of a unit like that. Really get an idea of what is happening in all the different areas and how can it be brought together in the most efficient way. And then last but not least, there's a question of like skills and expertise, and obviously with this rather expansive menu of options that we've presented, a lot of these areas will require expansion of skills, new staff. But once again, I think in many ministries, a lot of those skills are already present somewhere, but no one really knows where, or no one doesn't really know whether they exist. So one thing that we suggest ministries can do is to do a bit of a skill audit almost, and think about like what skills, if these are, for instance, if these are the 5 priorities that we set out in the strategy, do we have these skills? And if so, where, and which ones do we need, and where can we get them from? But I think, Nick, do you want to also bring in your perspective perhaps on the function side? Oh, yeah.
Great, thank you. Yes, I was going to say, Harold, I think you underplay your hand. I honestly do. You as Austria, you're a small country, but let's face it, you can encourage the EU, and you can set the pace. And actually, I can see you're already doing that on supplementing the EU ETS. And I think the many countries and members across the European Union can be inspired. So I think, and my impression is many member states would be very grateful for your leadership, and I think you can play an enormously important role. Indeed, you're underplaying your hand because I know you're already doing that. So please continue. The EU is very important in this equation. Maybe 3 areas to mention that maybe you could give some greater prominence to. I mean, I guess I agree with Annika writ large, though, that you're doing a lot, so the challenge is accelerating implementation, and you'll need the internal capabilities to do that, to execute and follow through on that. Maybe in terms of substantial policy areas, maybe ones which most finance ministries we see don't give enough attention to. So the first is kind of involved in the upstream economic policy development process, particularly I think the Inflation Reduction Act that President Biden's laid out has shaken up the whole climate community, because it's essentially a large-scale, nearly $400 billion industrial development strategy for industrial transformation towards net zero. And I think for you and the EU, really taking seriously this idea of a net zero industrial strategy, I think is enormously important. And I think that can, create the industries and jobs of the future, can be right at the technological and innovation frontier. I see it really more as an innovation strategy. I know old-fashioned industrial strategy has a bad name, so I would see this much more as 21st century industrial and innovation strategy. So that's the first thing. The second thing I'd say is many finance ministries that we've worked with are not fully appreciating some of the levers they have in terms of shareholder positions in state-owned enterprises, national development banks, sovereign wealth funds, pension funds, and really engaging with those entities in in the board, at the board level, and encouraging them to put together transition plans, I think could be very impactful, and help to solve some of the investment story side of things. And then finally, Harold, you mentioned, doing a lot in the financial sector, etc. I would encourage you to be even more active and potentially consider this idea of, a process to comprehensively stitch together all parts of the financial system that will be needed for transforming towards net zero. One really interesting observation I would have, I spoke to one of the senior leadership team in Aviva's sustainability team, which is one of the world's largest pension funds. And I said to them, why are you so concerned about net zero? Why are you so heavily invested in climate action? And they simply said a 4-degree world is uninsurable. And without insurance, the financial system falls over because you're not going to lend to uninsurable businesses, So insurance, can be the bedrock of the financial system. It's not hard to see how physical climate risk plays into that. So I think they'd be my three areas to mention.
Thank you, Nick and Annika. So there's still a lot left to do and homework, and where we can continue on working. And now I would like to turn to Frank. Last but not least, but most important, here for the Coalition Secretariat and also the co-chairs, the Dutch and the Indonesian co-chairs. And I would like to ask you about the future plans. And you have heard how much is already done in Austria. Maybe we can become a regional champion or something like that. But having said that, also the upcoming events, the 10th Ministerial in Marrakesh and also the COP meeting, our minister will definitely participate in both, and he's very keen on speaking also on sustainable finance. And so please give us an outline. Would be great. Thanks.
Okay. First of all, thank you so much for having me here. As was said before, my name's Frank van Lerven. I'm part of the Secretariat for the Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action. We have over 90 members at the moment and 26 institutional partners. I think we rather hastily went through the 6 Helsinki principles that we kind of work around, but just to give you a flavor of what we do, and it was put quite well by Pekka earlier, we're not in the business of creating policy recommendations or policy commitments, but it's more of a place where we can engage in mutual conversation and trust to foster a better, understanding of the challenges and opportunities that are out there to start forming some of the best practices that can start informing solutions. And in that light, a lot of what we do on a regular basis is host workshops where different ministries will present their work and the experiences that they've had and learn from each other. And that's effectively really the essence of what the coalition is. It's about learning from each other. It's about engaging in conversation. It's about, collaborating in that respect. And then there's the best policy practice, but then there's the next phase, I'd say, that we'd like to focus on is also on cross-border types of issues that need collaboration and dialogue on. And, we talked about financial spillover effects is definitely one of them. Any kind of instability that, especially emerging from transition risks from the financial system, will have spillover effects. And this is in part what the NGFS does, but obviously there's a role for finance ministers there. Carbon taxation is another area where we need to have, a conversation across borders because fundamentally these issues are connected. In terms of the actions that we're trying to do is kind of, there's been a great initiative led so far, especially by Pekka today, and we're very lucky to have him. The guide, in part, was one of our big first outputs that's really, we're trying to disseminate and make sure that we put that into action. So what next? And in that respect, we're trying to develop our capacity building initiatives. The biggest obstacle that we've had in many ways that we've heard obviously is funding, but the second biggest obstacle we hear from a lot of our members is that there's a lack of technical know-how. They want to do a lot, but actually at the ministry itself, how do we do this? And how do we implement these things in practice? So we try to do that obviously by sharing best practices, but now we have a range of capacity building programs that we're developing. We have our own capacity building catalog that we've developed with our own institutional partners. I am working at the World Bank specifically on a demand-driven, bespoke capacity building program called C3A. And what we're doing there is we're going into countries with ministries of finance, trying to understand, the needs that they need, and their own demands, and help them build their own analytical tools and models to inform policy. Specifically, I work on debt sustainability, so I'm very interested in anybody here from the budget team that's working on fiscal rules, how best you manage fiscal space, how you integrate climate risks, fiscal transition into debt sustainability analysis. And those are the types of things that we're trying to do at the coalition is share information, share the best modeling practices. And so if you'd also like to learn what other countries are doing in that respect, whether be it carbon taxation, I just mentioned debt sustainability, but all the different areas, please get in touch, and I'm be happy to kind of talk to you and see if we can start speaking to other ministries of finance and kind of just get a dialogue going on what's going on there, and maybe you have lessons that you'd like to share, or maybe challenges that you'd also like to share with them, and that's in essence kind of what we do. In the upcoming months, you mentioned we have this IMF ministerial in Marrakesh, where there will be actually, this time it's a bit different, Harold. We will open the floor up. It's not all just kind of coordinated 3-minute speeches that have all been prepared. There will be a bit of improvisation, we hope, and we're trying to make it a bit more interactive. At the same time, we'll be releasing a climate action statement that basically we've taken done a stock-taking exercise of all the actions of our members over the next year. And concisely, we can put this into 5 areas. Our members will be basically doing more around coordination and strategy. So basically how you build these sustainable finance strategies and so forth. The second area is building disclosure requirements, taxonomies, and reporting. The third area is carbon pricing. The fourth area is green finance mechanisms, innovative ways of funding the transition. And the fifth one is macroeconomic policies, whether be that green budgeting, green public finance, or more on the modeling side of modeling macroeconomic risks and the debt sustainability side. Finally, then we'll be at COP28 on Finance Day. We obviously started, and Pekka could probably talk more about this, because we don't think that decisions around climate change we can no longer afford to kind of marginalize those to environmental ministries. Ministries of finance need to be engaged in that discussion, and that's why we need to be at COP28, and we'll be there on Finance Day. So again, we invite you all to be there.
Thank you so much, Frank, for being short and being precise and inviting finance ministers to go there. And our minister, as I said, is certainly joining both meetings, the 10th Ministerial in Marrakesh and also the COP28. I have a bad time management, sorry for that, so I skip any summarization. I anyway run into troubles forgetting the most important things, but I would propose we stay 10 minutes more or a quarter an hour more, and you can come forward now with your questions if you have some, and I'm quite sure you have it. And please introduce yourself, and also let me know to whom you address your question. Sigrid. Somewhere is coming.
Thank you very much. Sigrid Stadl from the Vienna University of Economics and Business. I have a few questions, but in the interest of time, I just limit myself to one, namely to Annika. Thank you very much for your presentation, and I also looked through the 250-page report. What I'm interested in is, did you identify any best practices with regards to eliminating environmentally harmful subsidies? Because that's always on the very top of the list of what should be done. Of course, economists like it, and of course I understand the political dilemma of doing it, but are there any best practice examples? Is there a country, are there several countries that have done it, and how did they do it?
Are there any more questions? Gela? Nick?
Angela Köppel, Austrian Institute of Economic Research. I think Mr. Rumler made a very important point in his remarks, saying that climate change and climate action both have an impact. And I think this is also very important for finance ministries, because we are often discussing costs of climate policy action or how to finance transformation, but we're not as much talking about how to systematically implement the climate risks into budgetary planning. And I was wondering whether in the Austrian Finance Ministry there are steps in this systemic implementation of climate risks.
If there's no more questions, Annika?
Thank you, Sigrid. Excellent question. I'm just going to say one thing now, and then I'm going to hand over to Nick, because he is the one who actually wrote this section, so he is going to be in a better position to reply to it. But clearly, I mean, taking into account the kind of social justice component. Oh God, I feel like I'm talking very loudly. Sorry. The social justice component when reducing or removing fossil fuel subsidies is the central thing to do. I don't think I need to justify that in any further way. Which is one of the reasons why we kind of have the just transition as a cross-cutting kind of area in the framework. But Nick, do you want to maybe come in and talk about any best practices that we have mentioned in the guide?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, there's a whole section in the guide on fossil fuel subsidy reform. Tricky area. There's not many countries that have been hugely successful. The ones that have been, there's a little section in the guide on those. I was just looking now. There's a little case study on Indonesia, a little case study on India. There's a few others. There's a lot of spectacular examples of this done really badly. I won't mention any really big countries that you may have seen in the news recently, not in this part of the world, but you know, there's been some real challenges. So there's a lot on, there's not enough on what to do, how to do it well. There's not a significant number of examples, but we know quite a lot about what not to do. We've laid out in here, you know, what the latest best practice guidance suggests as certain important principles for reform. You know, they include things like inclusive decision-making, communicating price increases well in advance, some of the obvious things, but you'd be surprised how many countries don't do that. So have a look at that section. I think it's page 89 to 91. Have a look, and if you want to follow up, very happy to.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Nick. Becca also wants to comment. You too?
Yeah, I mean, I've been participating in some 300 panel discussions, and 295 of them have raised this question about subsidies and just get it done. It's a bit more complex than that. We know that there are exercises at the international level where you basically could go into talking about definitions for 2 decades or something like this. But the point is that it's not something that you just take on and off. They are embedded into your system. In Finland, for example, we have 193 tax-related. Most of them are in the tax system, by the way, and they are not kind of direct subsidies to some industry or things like that. So that's why the plan should be really to have comprehensive strategies and longer-term strategies on how to deal with them. That's a very sort of a fundamental issue. And there again, a lot of in Finland, for example, we're not trying to do a better job in terms of identifying those subsidies. In the broad sense, we know the main headline, whether which sector they are in, but that's where you need these kind of more comprehensive assessments on how the policies will impact the macroeconomics, competitiveness, and these kind of things. So tough issue, but hopefully there will be more concrete country cases in the next update of the guide.
Maybe just a final observation for me, which I forgot. I mean, it's amazing how many countries have fossil fuel subsidies and carbon taxation of the same sectors. so, you know, you can have a positive carbon price and negative carbon price, so they cancel each other out. So, you know, avoiding contradictions is enormously important as well. But $7.7 trillion the IMF just assessed in terms of the scale of fossil fuel subsidies, and less than $1 trillion being spent on the transition to carbon neutrality. So, yeah.
Well, just coming back to what Nick just said, I mean, price signals are nice in theory, but not so nice in political practice. And you just need to remember what happened during the Russian energy crisis and what the various governments did. I mean, in theory, the price signals would have been right. In practice, well, I think there's not a single European country that did not react in a way that's probably not recommended by the coalition. And on the things that we can do at the Austrian level, maybe I didn't say it clearly enough. That's what I meant. I mean, we're trying to push things at the EU level as a small country. Sometimes we've been very successful because we've been one of the few countries that have been pushing for the greening of the portfolios of international financial institutions long before the Sustainable Finance Action Plan came into existence. That dates back to previous terms of the Commission. But we've also tried to keep nuclear energy out of the sustainable taxonomy, and that was not so successful. So there are limits to what you can do as a small country. To the question of Ms. Köppel, when it comes to budgetary risks, my understanding is yes, but we have the leader of the climate team of the budgetary section back there. I'll refer that question to him. He'll be able to explain it much better than I could. But we do it at all levels. We also do it in the financial sector and at the macro level. And just to tell you one thing that we are worried about at the macro level, and maybe you're seeing this too, is actually the transitional risk. Because many people embark on sustainable finance, pension funds were mentioned. That means for some conventional industries, funding is drying up at the moment, which would be fine if the new technologies were already in place. But we're seeing some sort of crunch that the old industries are aging. They would need investment that they're not getting. So at a point, they're going offline. And if they go offline and the new forms of energy production are not yet there, we're in trouble. And at the moment, we see that there's a timing mismatch there. That is actually the biggest macro risk in the transition. But Jose, on the budget.
Please use the micro.
Absolutely. think you can hear me anyways. Thanks, Harald. So Jose Delgado, head of the climate unit in DG Budget. Angelica, with regards to your question, the current progress that we are making on identifying environmental harmful subsidies and to put it in a larger context, counterproductive subsidies will be published, will be covered and will be published within the Climate and Environment Report, that is a supplement report to the annual federal budget. And our methodology, as published in September last year, is built based on the green budgeting framework by the OECD and European Commission and has been further developed. So we do have a pretty heavy workload and have made significant progress over the past few months. By the way, something that we will discuss tomorrow in detail to give you an overview what we have been doing from DG Budget together with also DG Tax on carbon pricing. But there's a lot going on, and environmental harmful subsidies will be covered within that report in particular. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jose, and also mentioning that we have tomorrow the bilateral exchange with our experts to go into into depth what is already on the way and what we already have done. Are there any more questions? I take one. May I just take one more? We have outside coffee and drinks and little snacks. Please, we can continue afterwards outside. But I take, okay, both. Short questions. Short questions.
Yeah, keep it
No
very
comments.
short. Thanks a lot. So Angela from the Ban Ki-moon Center for Global Citizens. I would have a question on the coalition. So within the member countries, there are many developing countries there as well. And we've been talking a lot about capacity building, etc. So I'm wondering how the report takes into consideration also how to support those countries, looking at Kenya or others who do not have the financial resources or the staff capability now there to tackle all those things. I mean, even within UNFCCC negotiators, they insource them. So what's kind of the key and solution for action the report suggests on that as well?
Fanny?
Okay, so Fanny Dellinger, also from the Ministry of Finance. I basically wanted to come back to this issue of the investment gap that we are seeing, that you have already mentioned, that we actually need something like 4 trillion in investment, but are only getting 0.7 trillion. And so there's a significant gap. And at the same time, what we are seeing in terms of policy from ministries, so for instance, at the EU level at the moment, we are working on fiscal rules that are going to make it a little bit more harder to invest. We are seeing that the RRF is basically probably not going to be renewed. So that would be, that's currently driving investment in climate action at the European level, but how is this going to be continued? And then, of course, also from the central bank side, we are seeing that that interest rates are, of course, being raised, but also this is going to make it harder to invest in the future. So it's a bit difficult. And I was thinking, maybe you might comment on this, how we are going to deal with that. How are we going to bridge this investment gap?
Harald, thank you.
I'm going to say something now that some people might disagree with, but I don't think the investment gap is actually very big or even there. So I mentioned the 600 billion per year. That's the estimate of the Commission. And if you assume, so 600 billion would be roughly 3.8% of the EU's GDP. And if you assume that only half of that comes, and I'm saying let's keep the division 50-50 private sector, public sector, that means 1.9% for the public sector. And I haven't even made the split between the EU budget and the national budget, but that's, to me, that's a size that's absolutely manageable. I mean, why should it not be possible to reprioritize 1.9% of the public budget to finance the transition?
Yeah. So I'm probably going to try and answer both of those questions because it's too tempting as a macroeconomist not to get into some of the fun things here. So the first point that you mentioned is something that we deal with regularly, and it's a huge, huge issue because we don't want to do capacity building where there's two issues. And this is why I'm actually quite proud of the program I'm working with, despite it being at the World Bank, is that we do not want to go into a country and just teach them about transition and fiscal risks. That's because it's in many developing and low-income countries, it's not even relevant in the same way as it would be in Western financial systems with deep financial markets. So what we have to do is actually build stuff with the people that work there that know the most about what's going on within their own economies. And the second part to that is it's only going to be tangible and actually work, and they're only going to want to use the models that we help build with them if it's actually, you know, them that's in doing that. So what we're trying to do is also raise the funds to make sure that as we go in there, we're working with people that can work with us for at least 3 years, so that we have that funding to do that with them and have that funding. And it is possible, actually. There's the World Bank's budget is going up hugely, but there's also quite a bit of international aid going into that. So I'd say that that's a really important point you've raised, and it's something, you know, that's happening. On your second question about interest rates and things, I think one of a really interesting concept that is related to the higher interest rates is the fact that there's a carbon bias in raising interest rates, and that's because green investments have higher upfront costs and higher capital, and therefore that increases the attractiveness of carbon investments. Maybe that's good for Harold because, you know, as he just mentioned, there are some sectors and some dirty investments that need funding right now and they're not getting it. And that could be beneficial, but I do think it's a problem to grasp. I think that for the ECB, they're looking into certain things. For example, greening, retargeting financing operations. They've done a great job at trying to decarbonize their balance sheet through the collateral framework and the corporate bond purchasing program. I think the next step is realistically to make sure at least that refinancing programs are not financing dirty things. And I think that could be a powerful mechanism. I think that if you are worried about fiscal rules, taxation is an option there. You don't always have to borrow for investment, but it has to take into account, obviously, distributional aspects as well. And so there's a lot of discussion about fiscal rules. I actually worked a lot on it, but I don't think it's also a doomsday issue because there's plenty of funds out there that are looking for projects to invest in as well.
Thank you, Frank.
I would just like to add, because it links to the guide and what we are doing in the coalition in the first place, we are supporting the finance ministries so that they can, more professional way, take care of their own financial management. We have been discussing with credit rating agencies, and so to understand how climate affects their countries. Of course, the adaptation-related countries, which are really vulnerable, of course, they need help, and it's a different story. But in the big picture, it's a systemic change to all countries, and we want to support the finance ministries managing and dealing with this problem. So it's not about so much about you know, the climate negotiations globally, that transfer of money from rich to poor. We are not really dealing with that issue as such in the coalition.
So thank you so much, and sorry for the bad time management, but I do hope that it was interesting for you and that you enjoyed it. Please give all my panelists a big hand for being here. I have to say I would have had a final question, but I skip it. And all I think, what I take away is this necessity to work together in a constructive and best possible way to match, in my opinion, the short-term politics with the long-term economics. So please enjoy outside. Thank you so much.